Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Dan is away on military leave right now, so we're going to bring back some of our previous shows that didn't make it to the podcast. We hope that you enjoy them. As always, we welcome your feedback. Please share your thoughts and ideas at https://bit.ly/extension calling evaluation. That's https://bit.ly/extension calling evaluation, or rank us on your podcast app. If you'd like a written transcript of the show, please email me at Karen, Karen, .cox, COX, @mail, mail.wvu.edu, or call 304-234-3673. Thanks again for listening.
So we did want to talk about soil testing, and for you out there listening that doesn't necessarily have a farm or livestock, or maybe even just have a small garden, or don't have a garden but have a lawn, this stuff affects you as well, and it can really give you a headache if things aren't properly calibrated, and if you don't understand soil testing. Sometimes even the word fertilizer throws people off if they're not familiar with the nutrients that are required and the different types of fertilizer and what the numbers mean, which we wanted to get a little bit in on and talk about these things that, if it's the first time doing it, hey, more power to you that you're doing it. But, there are certain concepts that we'll hit on in terms of what nutrients mean what. And when we say fertilizer, what are we talking about?
We're also going to talk a little bit about lime and how to make sure you're getting good lime that's actually going to do what you need it to do on the ground. So we're going to start off with the most basic thing about soil testing, and that is, how often do you need to do a soil test? You should be testing your soil 1 to 3 years, and if you are making a significant change, say your pH was way off and you're adding 2 tons of lime, then you want to test it again the next year just to see where you are in that transitional process to get your soils to where you want them. Once your soils are where you want them, then testing every 3 years is perfectly fine. And again, for the state of West Virginia, we do provide free soil testing for now until the state budget comes through again. But we'll see what happens. So hopefully we can continue providing that service to our local agricultural producers, be they big or small. And if you are doing a soil test, there is a limit to the amount of soil you can include in one particular test. So, for example, if you have, 100 acres, you shouldn't include more than 10 acres per soil test. Really, your 15 is your 10 acres max, and you want 15 different spots throughout that 10 acres. If you only have a backyard that you're growing in, odds are it's going to be pretty uniform in its soil test. So you should probably be able to do just one soil test, even if you have 2 separate gardens that you do. So 2 raised bed gardens, you would test as one plot of soil, unless you're making significant changes in one to the other.
Right. And then also what the land's being used for. So you want to make sure it's represented. So when Cameron's talking about the gardens, you want to do a soil test for the gardens because you're using it as a garden. And then the lawn obviously has a different usage. So, that soil is actually going to be different in terms of the nutrients that are coming out, possibly the amendments that you probably made, because I'm sure if you're getting your hands in that soil, you're probably adding something. And if you're whether you've done a soil test or not, the soil test is just going to give you a little bit more specific recommendations and more when you're doing the amendments and putting the inputs in there. What you're doing is, instead of guessing what would be good, you're actually giving it what it needs. So you're not over applying or under applying anything, for that matter, or applying something that's not going to give you any results.
Right. That's really an important point to bring home, because You don't want to use too much fertilizer because A, it's expensive, and B, it's bad for the environment. And you don't want to use too little fertilizer because then the activity you're doing is not going to have your desired result. Again, when you're doing a soil test, it's to get those specific numbers that's going to tell you exactly what you need. When you're testing, and Dan made another good point about what it is that you're doing a soil test for. If you're doing grasses, they typically have fairly shallow root systems. So you're only going to be testing the top 2 inches or so of soil. Whereas if you're doing a vegetable garden or a row crop, you're going to go down 6 inches because they're going to typically have deeper root systems. So think about the plants that you're going to be growing, and that is why on our soil test forms there's a place to put, well, what are you growing in this area? So that's a really important thing to think about and to put in there.
That's right. So let's go ahead and let's talk about what's in a basic soil test. So at our office, a soil test is $12. They're not free like they are in West Virginia, which I think is a wonderful resource, and you should be taking advantage of it while you can and while it's there, because it's a really going to be a beneficial thing. If you're spending more than 10 hours a week, even the $12 investment in the Ohio side, I think is well worth it. Now, when you do a basic soil test, what you're going to get is you're going to get the pH of that soil. So the pH of the soil is how acid or alkaline it is. So I don't know if you remember back in high school, that pH scale that goes from 1 to 14, 1 being an acid and 14 being a base and 7 being neutral. The pH, the ideal pH for plants is between 6.5 and 6.9. So you want it just below the neutral, and you don't want it below 6 typically, although there are plants that don't mind it or actually do better with acidic soils. But for the most part, for most gardens, for most lawns, you're going to be shooting for about 6.5. And that's usually the recommendation they'll give. So you'll get the pH, you'll get the phosphorus levels, you'll get the potassium levels. Some people call it potash. So you'll get the phosphorus, potassium, you'll get the magnesium. And what you'll get is a nitrogen recommendation based on the yield that you want. Nutrients like phosphorus and potassium and magnesium and calcium as well. I overlooked calcium. Those are things that typically stick around. The calcium is also going to be very dependent on the type of soils that you have. Heavy clay soils, I think Karen's going to get into this a little bit, but heavy clay soils have a lot of calcium in them because the clay particles are very negative. So the calcium being a positive cation is going to stick around longer. It's going to be there. And that's also going to influence the chemistry of that soil. So when we talk about altering the pH of the soil or the chemistry, we're talking about the addition of lime. Now, let's say you do a soil test and your pH is at 6.9. Well, I wouldn't recommend any kind of liming amendments, and neither would the soil test, more than likely. So that's something that, we always say that, or at least I do, that lime is one of the most important things you can do for your soil because it frees up everything. You're not just adding one thing. But if you don't need it, you don't need it. And if you don't need it and you add more, you're not getting the benefits of it.
Right. And the reason that you need to adjust your pH, again, is to hit that sweet spot for most of the crops that we grow. Now, there are pockets of alkaline soils in our region, and those we'll talk about adding sulfur to make them more acidic. However, the majority of the soils we see are acidic soils, and so we are always trying to buffer them up a little bit to make them more alkaline. Now, there is a greater wiggle room for soils that have high organic matter content. They can tolerate without tying up nutrients. You can have be a little further on your acid or basic line if you have a high quantity of organic matter, and we're talking 7-8% organic matter. So it is a pretty high quantity. So now what Dan had mentioned before about the calcium ions, he was mentioning something that falls under the cation exchange capacity. And so basically, to put it really simply, imagine your soil particle as a kitchen table. There's only a certain number of chairs around it. Each chair is a seat for an element in your soil. And if the chairs are all taken up by acidic hydrogen ions, there's no room for anyone else to sit down. So you want to kick some of those acidic fellows out of their chairs, you add lime to the soil. Now, if you have sandy soil, your soil particle has fewer chairs, so it takes less lime to improve your pH. If you have clay-based soils, your soil particle kitchen table has lots of chairs, so the soil testing lab is going to tell you to add a lot more lime. And so basically what it boils down to is to make a change, you have to understand the soil makeup, which is why if someone has a sandy soil on an alluvial plain, they're not going to have to add as much lime as someone who has a heavy clay soil on the hillside. And that is strictly because of the soil construct and trying to fill up those empty chairs at the table around it.
Yeah, and guess what? You won't have to necessarily know yourself, because when you submit a soil test, they know the cation exchange capacity like Karen was talking about. The number of chairs in your soil, the lab knows, and that lime recommendation is going to be based on that. So here's kind of the take-home message then. If you have one of those little kits that you can kind of test the pH of the soil already, so you're talking about you're just talking about the pH that is there right now. You're not talking about the potential of that soil to move because of so many hydrogen ions being bound, and they can get released and interchange. So that's gonna change. So there's the amount of lime you're gonna put on there has to take into account how many of the they're called buffering ions. So the buffering capacity of those particles to keep it at that acidic level. So if you just take the pH and you're like, well, if I look something up, and if you don't know your cation exchange capacity, there's no way you're going to figure out how much lime you need to change that. So, it's like I said, it's not very expensive, and you really get detailed information on how to do it right.
Yeah, that's actually a question I get all the time. Well, I can get this soil pH test at the store, and is that good enough? Well, it's good enough if you already know what your soil is and that you've had several soil tests in the past, and you're just trying to monitor it on the side. That's fine for that. I know some people use them, especially in very controlled growing environments like greenhouses and high tunnels. But again, you need to have that starting point, that understanding of what the cation exchange capacity is of the soil. And the greatest thing about these soil tests is they do all of the math for you. They calculate it all out, and they give you that straight information of you need to transfer, like for example, if my soil pH was 4.6, then I need to add 4 tons of lime per acre, and that comes on the soil test report. That information is given directly to you. I will add a bit of caution, however. Sometimes you need to pay attention to that, and that's why Dan and I are here to help you interpret those soil tests. So, for example, 4 tons per acre, well, that'll adjust you to your correct pH, but you really shouldn't be adding more than 2 tons per acre per year, just because it's going to wash off the surface. It's not going to have that reaction time that it needs, because what you're doing is you're getting that lime to pull down into the soil. The microbes are going to interact with it. It's going to slowly bond to these soil particles, and it takes time. And if it can't get worked into the soil before it washes away, then again, you've wasted your time, money, and energy to put that onto the property.
That's right. So not all lime is created equal, right, Karen? So I think that's what she was getting into. Your gravel driveway, that limestone, but that's lime, right? It's lime, but because it's so coarse, it's such big rocks, it's not going to do any kind of neutralization at all, because it's just too big. The chemistry for the fine particles to actually interact with those hydrogen ions and the small, tiny little clay particles, it's just, clay is one of the smallest particles in terms of soil types. So you need really, really fine lime to be able to get in there and actually have some kind of effect on those clay particles. And that goes for all of them, because they're all small, but clay is actually the smallest. So, when you're buying lime, you need to buy some ag grade lime. And ag grade lime has a very specific fineness to it. I think actually Karen has some measurements that you can go by, but when you're just buying lime from the quarry, if you get something that's not necessarily ag grade lime, it might not be doing not a thing for you.
That's right. And even some of the stuff you buy at the stores for your lawn, it's not going to actually do anything because its mesh size is too large to actually have any effect. So, for example, if you take a screen that has 16 wires across and 16 wires down, that would be a 32 mesh. Basically, that's 32 holes that those particles can fall through.
Per square foot.
Yes, per square foot. Thank you. And so basically, your smaller particles are going to be a finer mesh size. So you have, and that's the numbers of wires in a 1 inch length of screen. Sorry. Okay, so if you have 100 mesh, that means that you have almost a dust that you're applying. And so if you're trying to apply 100 mesh lime on a windy day, it's just going to blow away. None of it's going to hit your soil, and you're going to be wasting your time. However, you're going to get 100% reaction in 1 year or less, or in 6 months or less with 100 mesh. So if you need to make a change quick, then you want to look at those higher mesh numbers. A 60 mesh, you're going to get 100% reaction in 1 year or less. And that's pretty much where most of our ag lime is going to fall, is in that 60 mesh. Now, if you have a 20 mesh, just for example, you're going to have only 50% of your reaction in the first year. And then it's going to take more time to break down those particles into a small enough particle to actually have an effect in the soil. So if anything's larger than a 20 mesh, you're wasting your money. It's not going to have an effect in a timely enough manner that it will help your crop grow. So your 20 mesh is going to work slowly. It's better for that extended release effect for adjusting very acidic soils over a longer period. And your 100 mesh is like a fine dust, but you have to be careful that you're not applying it on a windy day.
That's true, Karen. And here's something I get a lot. The question I get a lot about is pelletized lime. So pelletized lime. Pelletized lime means that it's got little pellets. They were able to bind it somehow. And that's the fineness. They don't talk about the fineness of the pelletized lime. But the nice thing about the pelletized lime, I would say this, is that it's easier to handle. So Karen was just talking about, the 100 mesh lime it's just like dust, right? And if you're dropping it from anything over 3 feet, the wind's just picking it up and taking it elsewhere, kind of like drift pesticides. But the nice thing about pelletized lime, I will say this, handling wise, it's easier to get to accurate amount. It's going to work its way in because it's nice and it's got a little round pellets. It's like working with clover seed versus grass seed, It works its way down, which is where you want it. And once that pelletized lime gets down there, it's the coating's going to break down. It's going to start incorporating and neutralizing that soil there. So I'm not going to say that pelletized lime is better, but it's easier to handle. And you can take that for what it's worth. And it's going to be more expensive, obviously, because there's a little extra to it. But in terms of neutralization potential, it's about the fineness. And if you get that ag grade lime, you get a neutralization power of 100%. So you'll get the amount. In fact, the soil test is based on that 100% neutralization power. So the amount that's on your soil test directly applies to the agricultural grade lime.
Sometimes. Because what you have to do is you have to read the label. You have to read the label just like anything else, because when you're looking at ag lime, it might be dolomitic lime, it might be, which will have a higher magnesium content, it might be a different, what you need to know is that CCE number, the calcium carbonate equivalent. And so, soil tests give you that 100% calcium carbonate equivalent. So when you're reading your bag of lime, if you see that it's 80% calcium carbonate equivalent, then you're going to need more lime to meet that 1 ton. So say, for example, just for easy math, if it's a 50% calcium carbonate equivalent, you're going to need twice the amount of lime as is called for on your soil test report so that you can have that same calcium carbonate equivalent.
No, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah, that soil test report, the soil test report is based on 100%. And you can also have the opposite effect where you can get some hydrolyzed lime and you're going to be over 100%, right? So what that means now is you're probably going to take it lower. And so if you got 120%, you're going to put 1/5 parts lower to the soil than is recommended on your soil test. So, most ag lime is going to be at 100%. And if that's the case, you can go directly by your soil testing recommendations, because that's what it's based on, 100% calcium or neutralizing power. If you are going by you have to look at the bag, and then you have to make the call based on the soil test. So the soil test is based on 100%. If the bag deviates from that, you got to make the mathematical adjustments. Like Karen was saying, if you got 50% neutralizing power, you got to put twice as much. If you got 150%, you got to put 1/3 less.
Yeah, and so, you have to know how big your garden is, how big your yard is, or how big your farm is, and how much area you're applying this lime to. And then you need to make that financial decision as to whether or not you want to pay the extra for that hydrolyzed lime that's going to work a lot faster and have a higher CCE equivalency, but it's a whole lot more expensive. So if you're looking at a large area, it might not be what you want to go with. If you have really acidic soil, you're going to want to lean more towards a lower mesh number, as long as it's above 20, and that's going to give it a longer reaction time. It's going to stay there longer, it's going to stay put, and it's going to react longer. If you need a quick reaction, you want a higher mesh size. So the mesh size is going to fall into the speed of reaction. So obviously a hydrolyzed lime is going to be super fast because it's been chemically treated to be the smallest particle that they can actually manage. And then your CCE, or your calcium carbonate equivalent, is what you're going to use to calculate out against the tonnage that's recommended on the soil test report. Together, those two things are going to give you your total neutralizing value.
So not all lime is equal. And again, you don't have to memorize exactly what the mesh sizes are, but look for ag grade lime. And I think if you see ag grade use, you're thinking 100%, and most likely you'll be fine. Now, one thing that Karen was talking about is the potential for reaction. If you are surface applying lime, it's not going to react as fast as if you are in a garden and you are incorporating that lime. So that's something else to think about. If you are tilling in the lime, chances are you're going to get a faster reaction than if you're just surface applying onto a pasture field. And you can't always till. So, it is what it is. And you just have to make, again, I call it managerial decision making. So you think about the situation and you make the best call for that situation. It might not be the call that your neighbor makes because maybe he's putting lime on his field for growing corn. And you know what? If he's incorporating that lime, if he's tilling and mixing that lime up really good, chances are he's going to get the neutralizing potential a lot faster than you are because he's got more surface area. But also he's probably going to be using a little bit more lime because he is going, 6 inches, maybe even 12. So when you're doing your soil test and you specify whether you're tilling, they take that into account additionally.
Yeah, definitely. Till and no-till is going to change how you're applying your nutrients and especially your lime. And again, it takes us back to that 2-inch soil sample versus a 6-inch soil sample. How deep are you going to be applying these nutrients and these fertilizers in your lime? You need to know that up front, and it's based on what type of crop you're doing. So you don't want to, if you have a pasture field and the nutrients you're applying only need to go down 2 inches, you don't want to send in a soil test that has 6 inches of depth on it, because then you're going to get a reaction or a recommendation rate to change that 6-inch depth when you only need to be changing a 2-inch depth. So it's going to cost you a lot more. So make sure you know what you're growing. Make sure you do a soil test. And if you have questions about the interpretation of your soil test, give Dan or I or your local extension agent a call.
That's right. Well, we got as far as lime today. there's still nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium. We touched on calcium a little bit, but
ton of micronutrients
and we can go into the micronutrients, but
right now we are out of time. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.